Okay, welcome to part 10 of the current Lunch and Learn series for the Tampa IIBA. This week, we're gonna talk about how the practice of business analysis is the same and different than other practice areas, and talk some about certifications in all the areas, at least that I'm familiar with. Um, what I've been doing is computer simulation of various kinds for about 30 years. I did it in different industries with different architectures for different applications. So I had the chance to attack different problems from a lot of different sides. And that's what helped me really get into and understand business analysis at a deep level. So, what is business analysis? As BAs, we're going to start from our home territory and then work out from there. The way I see it is you do all these things in order to work through a problem and serve a customer. There's a wrapper of project management at the begin and end, and then there's trying to figure out what the problem is, trying to figure out what's going on now. That's the as is state. I call that a conceptual model. There's dealing with data to describe everything you've discovered in the conceptual model. There's identifying what the customer needs, functional requirements, and what the solution has to be, non functional requirements. Then we do a design, figure out how we're gonna solve the problem. Then we actually solve it in the implementation, and we test it and we see if we can drive it through to acceptance. That particular framework lines up quite well with the structure of the Babcock itself. So the Babcock has a lot of general material about what business analysis is and a bunch of techniques and so on. But the core of what you do is actually in these 6 sections, which more or less tell a story about how you work your way through an engagement or a problem. And the way I structure the way I think about it, top to bottom in the left margin here, um, matches up, if you can see by the heavy axis, pretty well from upper left to lower right. You can make a case that other things match too, but the overall trend is clear. I described in the past how the way the Babcock has you do stuff is kind of loose and diffuse because you never solve any business analysis problems the same way. So it gives you a loose framework and not a hard and fast way of doing things. The way I think about my framework is simply streamlined down to this: figure out what problem you're gonna solve, find out what's going on now, get the data, do the requirements, propose a design, do the implementation, then test. Everything really comes down to that. And we also iterate within each phase, working with the customer and the various participants to make sure that we've achieved a mutual understanding of what's going on. We also iterate between phases. So we figure out what the problem is, we agree to that, we move on, we figure out what's going on now, we agree to that, we move on, and so on. But anytime you find you missed something in a previous phase, you can always go back to it, and we'll touch on that later. Basically, this is essentially the scientific method, and that's worked out pretty well. And business analysis is really about solving problems from the customer's point of view, whether they are internal or external customers. Just for some background and to give us some common vocabulary, I use the word engagement to describe how we work with customers going through any effort or project. That's kind of the meta that's outside the solution. The system is what they're doing or what they're going to do to actually solve their problems and serve the customers. And then the solution is the change we make to that system, either modifying an existing system or building an entirely new one. So, here are 50 techniques from the Babok. The way I broke it down is there are 30 that are primarily devoted to working out the solution for the customer, 11 that are primarily about managing the engagement itself, and another 9 that could serve in both cases. The way I figure it, the practice of business analysis is more about solving the problem than directly managing the engagement, but it's kind of hybrid in that it does both. And what we'll see going forward is every practice area actually has to serve the customer or it wouldn't exist. By the way, anytime you see a link in orange that goes to some kind of a link to further material, this and all these presentations and slides are on my website. I'll explain how to get to those in at the end. So, what practice areas are we going to compare to? Business analysis has a bunch of different certifications you can get, mostly by the IIBA, but PMI, the Project Management Institute, has started to get into the act. Then project management has its whole raft of certifications. That's a pretty big overlap with everything. Then Agile and Scrum, there are at least 4 and probably a lot more organizations that support a whole pile. It's almost embarrassing dealing with Agile and Scrum. I think it's overkill. For process improvement, there are several different areas within that discipline. Some of those you can get certifications in from different institutions. The ASQ is mostly the big one for that. Data analysis, that's a more general topic. The IIBA has a certification for that. Cybersecurity, the IIBA has one for that, but there are tons of vendor specific and more general certifications you can get. System architecture, there are a few more ITIL and TOGAF for actual certs. BPMN is just a notation methodology, but there are probably some wild people out there who do a certification in it. And then there are tons of skill or specific product-based certifications you can get by every vendor under the sun. I won't talk about that too much because there are tons of different tools and programming languages and so on that you can build solutions out of. Here's the way I put it into a grid. The different organizations are across the top, the different practice areas are along the side. All the organizations have a specific emphasis, but many organizations dabble in other cross practice areas as well. Again, the two big Scrum organizations are the Scrum Alliance and Scrum.org, and there are a zillion different certs in that area. I'll revisit that shortly. So, because these are general practice areas, there's always going to be some overlap. A lot of the same content, concepts and methodologies appear in many different practice areas. So we'll try to identify the differences in emphasis for each. For example, last week I was studying up to renew a bunch of certifications in Agile and Scrum, and they really discussed a lot of solid material, but a lot of it was really not emphasized within that practice. They talk about ROI, but that's more a project management thing. In project management, they tell you how to do it. Whereas in Agile and Scrum, they talk about how to do other things. So, what is project management? The PMBOK, which is basically their equivalent of the BABA, lists 12 practice areas about, and 5 different phases. So start the process, plan how you're gonna do it, execute, monitor, and change based on what you're doing, and then close. The PMBOK 6 made the process a little bit more streamlined than what they had in version 4. Can you see the Excel sheet here?
No,
Can you?
no, I can see. I can see only PowerPoint slide. No Excel
Okay,
sheet.
Yeah, it's just a blue screen.
that's fine. If you click on these links here, you can see the study grid I made up for the material in the PMBOK, which goes into a lot more depth than this chart here. And it has for each subject matter area in each phase where there's an X here, and it shows the inputs, the techniques, and the outputs. I like what they did in the PEMBOK version 6. Version 7 is actually going to be released on Sunday. And they made the language much more consistent and the whole process more modular. So I think it's a good streamlining and regularization. And they've also made the whole thing more compatible with Agile. So, project management is mostly about the engagement, but the more you know about what's going on inside the work, it's better. So, when I said project management is a wrapper that goes around anything else or everything else, it's kind of like Dale Carnegie said, tell them what you're going to say it, and then tell them what you said. And the project management, plan the work, do the work, control the work, and close the work works kind of the same way. In a previous presentation, I actually showed a video clip of sharing that Dale Carnegie quote as he's an engineer prepping his team to give a large presentation. So this stuff is out there. And there are a lot of different management methodologies. Those are three of the obvious one in the pictures to the left. So, a lot of the project management practices were driven by waterfall, but good managers have always allowed a lot of feedback and correction and adaptation within that form. So, you never just march through point by point and never go back. You're always changing and adapting. If for no other reason that a bad manager might not have time to do everything right, but there's always time to do it over at the end. So be a good manager and not a bad one. And even if the other practice areas don't talk about planning and resources and budgeting, somebody some places, and that's kind of what project management does. So, Agile and Scrum. If you look at the wiki entries forum, they both cross link to basically a zillion other management ideas. They're kind of loose, and there's an argument as to just how useful those concepts are. Agile was basically created in response to what certain people saw as specific problems that exist in as of the late 90s, but even its creators have kind of gone on to a more general approach that is really based on simply talking to people, looking at where you are, and then adjusting based on that feedback and continuing forward. So the feedback and iterative action method I talked about does the same thing. And that's always been the case. Um, the real big takeaway of what Agile and Scrum really give you is that they make organizations flatter and more responsive. And that's really their big value add. Um, if people are talking to each other, they can't get too far off track before things break. And none of what's going on in Agile or Scrum, even if you're pushing things down to lower levels, obviates the need for high level awareness and planning. So there seems to be a whole industry really supporting this stuff and working in this tradition, but I'm trying to figure out how much of a standalone practice it really is. So those are all books from training courses I've taken. Every other training course I took was in far more detail than these. And most of what's in those books really isn't about Agile and Scrum. It's a bunch of generalized software skills. And they it, those methodologies are supposed to be about general processes and not just software projects, but nonetheless, much of the material they actually sell you has to do with software. And I could go into reasons I think the whole practice is goofy. So, the vast majority of Scrum certs are at the base level. For example, Scrum.org lists the number of certificates of each kind, and there are like 400,000 Scrum Masters, about 100,000 product owners, and far less developers. And of all the higher level certifications they have, there are only a few thousand of each, literally, and that's probably as it should be. Um, I think that Scrum Master should be somebody who's serving another role and doesn't do Scrum Mastering full time unless they're supporting multiple teams and acting as a coach. I go off on a little bit of a jag here. The whole Agile and Scrum thing as a specific industry of certifications and consultants and so on is overblown and possibly should not exist. We can talk about that over coffee sometime. Um, I think it's good for there to be some kind of low level general certification that talks about some of these same issues, but the degree to which they've gone is over the top. Please feel free to write to me or tell me I'm a blithering moron if you disagree. So now let's talk about process improvement. That's the next big practice area we're going to address. You've heard about Lean Six Sigma. They are actually two different things. They're two sides of the same coin. Six Sigma, as it turns out, is really technically about reducing variation. And if you reduce variation, then you'll squeeze down your outcomes into a narrow range so that fewer and fewer of the outcomes will be outside the acceptable range, so that'll reduce the errors and waste. Lean is about redoing things, rearranging things to do more with less. So Six Sigma is about quality, Lean is more about efficiency. Six Sigma is also more of a science with a lot of specific numerical and analytical procedures and techniques, and Lean is more of an art. There are some general rules to follow, but in the end, uh, you really have to mostly do it by feel. Most of my career, I've been doing lean and I've done very little formal Six Sigma. Total quality management, that's been around for a long time, and its shtick is this: it defines quality as meeting whatever standards you set. So if you define, for example, that quality is a car that lasts 500 miles before falling apart, well, then that's quality. The customer might not like it. So, but however you define it, that is quality. You've all heard of W. Edwards Deming. He was a very famous pioneer in quality and statistical control. He lived from 1900 to 1993, had a very long life and career. He was one of many famous people in the field. Also, the Toyota production system is an overarching management approach, but it's real big on quality and it's known for that almost above anything else. One thing to know about process improvement is you aren't only improving existing processes, it should also be part of the design process as you're iterating through different design concepts to make everything as good as you can. We came up with a slogan at one company I worked with that did simulation, and it basically said, "We do it 1,000 times, so you do it right the first time." So we go through lots of thinking and iterating and evolving to get you a really solid design. I know the shuttle system at the Dallas Fort Worth airport because, if those things fail and they're in the middle of a track someplace, and they break, it's going to be real difficult to get them fixed and get them clear. So they did a full FMEA analysis, which is failure modes, effects, and analysis, to try to head off everything they could think of that would get things stuck. There are a bunch of different techniques that are used in um, process improvement in different situations. Plan, do, check, act, demand. UDA actually comes out of the military and Air Force guy came up with it, and it's about orienting yourself in a situation before acting and figuring out what you're going to do. Those processes are iterative, and they're like the iterative framework I've designed and described to him. The Lean Six Sigma Black Belt cert was by far the most difficult to get. I learned the most and it took the most time. The other things were not comparatively that difficult. I will say one thing, however, and that is that all the other certifications weren't things I'd done a lot of. So the more experience you have and the more raw material you have in the way of experiences and observations and mental images, the easier it's all going to be. Next, we'll talk about data analysis. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do with data: collect it, condition it, move it, transform it, integrate it, store it, document it, analyze it, safeguard it, display it, communicate it, and manage it. And you can go down as many rabbit holes as deep as you'd like. I did a presentation a little while back that described how you do discovery to figure out what's in a system. That's the qualitative nouns and verbs. And then you do data collection to get the quantitative information that characterizes all the elements. So, with data, you can do AI, machine learning, simulation, and all the other things. And that data basically, you do everything with data. Everything is data driven. I was like thinking about what's going on in nuclear particle accelerators. Imagine trying to figure out what's going on or what your house looked like just after it was blown to smithereens by a large bomb. And all you have for data is a bunch of theory about what bricks and wood and pipes look like, but all you have is a movie of what happened if stuff is flying away from the house. So that's an interesting way to think about data. Next, we'll talk about cybersecurity as a practice. Most of us are not experts in it. I certainly know I am not. However, I can use my business analysis skills to talk to them to make sure all their work is integrated into any solution I develop, and I know their work addresses every part of every use case within a system. One of the most important things that this practice does is actually deals with stuff that's not even in the system. The biggest vulnerability any system has is actually the users and administrators. They actually call trying to exploit that part of any system social hacking. This is a smaller, more specific practice area. There are many others like programming in different languages, um, artisting in industrial design, and so on. We might not be experts as BAs in all those things, but we should know how to talk to people to incorporate and integrate their work in a similar way. System architecture is the last big practice area I want to compare to. It's the specification in of any system using any appropriate notation or language. That is one there. That's one kind of description of a paper mill. There are some formal kinds of system descriptions. TOGAF, for example, is a formal methodology. It's a process description methodology, and you can get certifications in it. The others, business process, I forget modeling notation, something like that. P&IDs is process and instrumentation diagrams. They talk about how physical process systems, usually when liquids, but not always, how they work operationally and conceptually. There are also layout drawings that show how the all the equipment is physically configured. There are also building information management systems and a lot of other industry standards that exist and are being brought into use. One thing all subject matter areas or practice areas have in common is they all break problems down in some way. So they all do functional decomposition. In different practice areas, it looks different, but it's all driving to the same thing. Within the practice of business analysis, I call the process of figuring out what's going on within a system is discovery. And that gives you the nouns and verbs of what's in there and what it all does. And that drives the functional and non functional requirements. You may do discovery as part of the design phase if you're building a whole new system from scratch. In project management, you basically break things down from the top and make a giant outline with everything you can think of that you're going to have to address. If you're doing waterfall, you want to try to be complete from the beginning, but we know that's largely impossible. You're always gonna need to be able to adapt and change. In Agile and Scrum, we basically have a backlog that we develop and groom. That's really what gives us our work items, and that's the context in which we think about breaking down problems. In process improvement, we have to understand systems to be able to get to the root of what's going on with them. And there are many different approaches for doing that. In data analysis, we have to understand all of our data, where it comes from, what it means, and so on. You have to do discovery first so you know what data to collect. In cybersecurity, you have to know what all the parts of the system are before you can secure them. And in system architecture, a system is built up of all the component pieces. So you're doing the same thing over and over. So the pictures there are on the left is a work breakdown structure that those are just the top 2 or 3 levels of it. They can be composed down as deep as it makes sense. In business analysis and in a lot of the other practices, we break things down into all the implementation items and design items, and we make sure they link from the problem statement all the way through test and acceptance. So we can compare and make similar diagrams for work breakdown structure. If you imagine an organization doing safe and you tried all the work numerous parallel teams might be doing in terms of their backlog items, whether they're drawing from individual separate backlogs or sometimes sharing backlogs, um, that gives you an idea of all the work that has to be done. If you look at a giant Microsoft project layout, that might have all the tabs in a schedule, and that might show dependencies. And based on that information, you can plot out critical path, um, to say what's the longest this process should take, and where am I running into a problem as far as getting deliverables out. That's specifically a thing that's taught in project management. And then by the same token, you can do minimum viable process and releasable increment analyses. So we're almost to the end. A lot of specific how-to information is buried in each practice area. It generally makes sense, but we want to really understand, if we take all that out, what the overall point of each practice area is. Um, no matter what you're doing in life, and I'm picturing myself sitting in a restaurant in Thailand in 1998 for the 10th time, eating Chinese steak on sizzling plate and reading this book by Paulo Soleri. I realized he's talking about the big question in life and how to be a good person and so on. And that's what we're always trying to do. So, what I'm realized is that all these bodies of knowledge are really driving toward the same end, and that's figuring out how to support customers and really let us work the most intelligent, effective way we can. So, in summary, business analysis is about how to solve problems for customers based on their requirements. It's more about developing the solution, but if you look at the typical way business analysts are often thought of, they're kind of the go between the customers who have their needs and the specialist implementers that know how to fill those needs. And they make it easier for those groups to understand each other. Business analysts can be a lot more than that, but that's their primary function. They are learning and communication and translating machine. Project management is how to arrange the actual work. It's a wrapper around the other practices. Agile and Scrum are really about how to flatten teams and organizations to make them more intelligent at lower levels. Ultimately, what those practices tell you is to get people to talk to each other and to iterate and correct as often as possible. Process improvement is how to make activities more consistent and more efficient. Data analysis works in service to all the other practice areas. The whole universe is data, is driven by data, is suffused with data, and so on. Cybersecurity is all about how organizations and systems safeguard data and processes, and system architecture is about designing and configuring systems using specific tools. And we have gotten to the end. Um, do we have any questions? One, and let me make two announcements. Since Cliff is not with us, there is another presentation at the same time next week, and I believe we also have a evening presentation at our monthly meeting on Tuesday, approximately um, August 16th or so. So keep a heads up for that.
Thanks, Bob. That's actually August 17th. It's Tuesday.
That's it. Thank you.
Thanks.
And Cliff is there. All I need to
Mm.
do is learn to read.
I was a little late. Not a problem.
Okay, well, that's what I've gotten for this week. I will post all this information and I will see you next week. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Bob. See you next week.